The room froze. Cameras captured it, the precise second when Judge Allison Jones leaned back in her chair, lips parted just slightly, eyes narrowing with the kind of disbelief that words alone could never contain. It was the look of a woman who had just witnessed something extraordinary, something powerful enough to strip the air out of the chamber. And then came the question, whispered not in words, but in the silence that followed. What did Jasmine Crockett just say that left the entire room and millions online speechless? Moments earlier, the chamber had been drenched in arrogance. It was the same script Americans had seen 100 times before. Condescension dressed up as authority, smug dismissals passed off as reason. The kind of sneering confidence that assumes dignity has no place at the table. The antagonist had commanded the room with their booming voice, their rehearsed smirks, their unshakable belief that intimidation would triumph. And for a fleeting second, it seemed they were right. But then, Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her words didn't rise in volume, they cut in precision. She wasn't loud, she was undeniable. It was the difference between thunder and lightning. One demands attention through noise, the other through impact. Every syllable carried weight. Every phrase dropped like a hammer against the marble floor of the chamber. And as she finished, the smirk on the antagonist's face faltered, replaced by the first hint of doubt. Judge Allison Jones blinked, stunned. This wasn't grandstanding. This wasn't politics as usual. This was something else, something alive, and outside those walls the country leaned forward. Phones lit up. Screens replayed the moment in real time, and whispers began racing through the bloodstream of social media. People didn't just hear Crockett's words, they felt them. Immigrants saw their own struggles reflected. Young activists heard validation for their fight. Everyday Americans who had been told to sit down and be quiet suddenly found a voice echoing their own. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The chamber was designed to silence, to discipline, to bury dissent under procedure and pomp. Yet, here it was, disrupted, overturned, broken open by the clarity of one voice. And if a single response could leave a federal judge speechless, what would happen when that voice reached the rest of America? Because this wasn't just politics, it was history unfolding in real time, and the ripple was only beginning. The setting could not have been more combustible. A high-stakes hearing, the kind that draws cameras like moths to a flame, was already charged with partisan tension. The marble walls reverberated with centuries of tradition, but inside, it felt more like a battlefield than a courtroom. Every glance, every whisper, every shift in posture carried political weight. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens scratching, as if history itself demanded transcription in real time. At the center of it all sat the antagonist, oozing confidence. They leaned back in their chair, radiating that smug self-assurance of someone who believes the outcome has already been written in their favor. To them, this wasn't a contest, it was a performance, and they were convinced they held the starring role. Each word they delivered was punctuated with a smirk, as if daring anyone, especially Jasmine Crockett, to challenge their authority. But beneath the veneer of arrogance, the stakes were monumental. It wasn't just reputations hanging in the balance, it was credibility itself, the very definition of justice, the values of truth and fairness that millions of Americans still dared to believe in. To the antagonist, this was about maintaining control, preserving a system that had always tilted in their favor. To Crockett, it was about something larger, the dignity of people who had too often been silenced, the principle that truth should never bow to power. Judge Allison Jones knew the gravity of the moment. Her very presence underscored it. She was there not just to preside, but to witness, to ensure that whatever unfolded would be weighed against the scales of fairness. And as her eyes swept the chamber, she could sense the undercurrent, the nervous energy of a country watching, waiting, hoping for something different. The tension grew as the antagonists delivered their barbs. Their voice carried with rehearsed authority, mocking, dismissive, dripping with the certainty of someone who had never truly been held accountable. The chamber echoed with their confidence. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that this very arrogance was laying the groundwork for their undoing. Crockett sat poised, her expression calm, her silence sharper than any interruption. She didn't flinch. She didn't bite at the bait. Every second of composure was a counterweight to the antagonist's theatrics, and though the cameras captured every frame, most viewers didn't yet realize what was building beneath the surface. Because this wasn't just another hearing. This wasn't another round of political theater destined to vanish into the news cycle. No, this was a moment of reckoning, and like all reckonings, it would arrive suddenly, shattering the illusion of control that the antagonist wore like armor. For the audience at home, the suspense was mounting. Was this going to be just another example of arrogance steamrolling over truth? Or would something different break through? Millions leaned closer to their screens, sensing the pressure, but not yet glimpsing the release. And then came the pause, the moment before the shift, the silence before the storm. Judge Jones's gaze lingered, the reporter's pens stilled, the antagonist smiled a little too wide. But what was about to happen would flip the balance of power in the room, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't waiting for permission. She was waiting for the perfect moment, and when it came, her voice would not just cut through the arrogance, it would redefine the battle entirely. Long before the cameras flickered on and the hearing began, the antagonist had built a career on one thing: dominance. They were the kind of figure who thrived in the spotlight, who saw every exchange not as a dialogue, but as a contest to be won. For years, they strutted through politics with the air of entitlement, convinced that experience, connections, and privilege gave them an unshakable shield. Their reputation wasn't grounded in fairness or vision, but in sheer force of personality, the belief that intimidation itself was a political strategy. They had mastered the art of contradiction. On the campaign trail, they championed themselves as defenders of the common people, yet their record told another story. Votes that gutted protections for working families, speeches that demonized immigrants, policies that favored corporate donors while hollowing out the very communities they claimed to protect. They preached family values while turning a blind eye to corruption in their own circle. They spoke of law and order, but bent rules whenever it suited them. And in every case, they assumed the contradictions would be overlooked, drowned out by their sheer ability to command attention. Arrogance was their constant companion. In hearings, they often leaned back in their chair with a theatrical sigh, a hand raised in mock patience as though granting their opponent permission to speak. When challenged, they would chuckle, not the warm laugh of a leader at ease, but the calculated smirk of someone who believed themselves untouchable. To them, hearings weren't forums for truth, but stages for their own performance. Every gesture was a signal of disdain. The dismissive wave, the rolled eyes, the sarcastic tone dripping with mockery. It wasn't that they underestimated Jasmine Crockett specifically. It was that they underestimated anyone who didn't fit their mold. They saw Crockett's identity, her background, her rise from grit rather than privilege, as proof that she could be bent or broken under pressure. In their world, dignity wasn't power. Power was loudness, status, the ability to outshout and outmaneuver. Crockett's calm presence was, to them, a sign of weakness. Their allies fed into the illusion. They whispered reassurance in back rooms, promised that the hearing was under control, that the antagonist's reputation for rhetorical beatdowns would carry the day. And why wouldn't they believe it? For years that strategy had worked. Opponents often stumbled under the glare of their smug cross-examinations, caught between defending themselves and dodging ridicule. Clips of their mic drop takedowns circulated on partisan media, reinforcing the myth of invincibility. In the chamber that day, the pattern seemed poised to repeat. The antagonist's opening lines were sharp, barbed, rehearsed. They mocked policy positions they barely understood, twisted statistics into sound bites, and spoke over Crockett with a rhythm designed to dominate. They wore their confidence like armor, every dismissive smirk daring her to respond. To the casual observer, it looked as though the antagonist had the upper hand. Even Judge Allison Jones, trained to maintain neutrality, seemed to brace for yet another one-sided spectacle. But arrogance is a dangerous foundation. Behind the mask of control, cracks were already forming. The antagonist's overconfidence made them sloppy, repeating lines that rang hollow, leaning so heavily on mockery that substance fell away. Their contradictions were visible to anyone paying close attention. They spoke of patriotism while undermining democratic norms, of integrity while defending allies caught in scandal. They were so sure of their ability to control the narrative that they didn't notice how brittle it had become. And Crockett noticed as the antagonist grew bolder, mocking her with smug asides and exaggerated eye rolls. Crockett's silence was louder than their jeers. She didn't take the bait. She didn't rush to interject. Instead, she let the antagonist pile arrogance on arrogance, building a tower so top-heavy that all it would take was one precise strike to bring it crashing down. Viewers watching from home could feel it, the slow tightening of a coil, the sense that something was coming. The antagonist believed they were scripting another triumph, but in reality, they were digging their own trap. The louder they became, the calmer Crockett remained. The more they mocked, the steadier she held her ground. It was a duel of styles, arrogance versus dignity, noise versus clarity. For years, the antagonist had relied on intimidation to silence dissent. But in that chamber, under those lights, their strategy was about to meet its limit. Because arrogance can command attention, but it cannot command respect. It can intimidate, but it cannot inspire. And that day, for the first time in a long career built on dominance, the antagonist would learn a lesson they had never prepared for. But arrogance has one fatal flaw. It underestimates dignity. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that chamber, before her name became a rallying cry across timelines and living rooms, she was something far more ordinary and far more extraordinary. She was a child of grit, raised in a world that didn't hand out shortcuts. Her story was not written in the polished marble of privilege, but carved into the rough edges of persistence. She grew up with the understanding that dignity is not a gift, it is a fight, and sometimes the only weapon you have is your voice. From a young age, Crockett learned what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers looked past her, officials doubted her, gatekeepers quietly hoped she would stumble. Yet every slight became fuel. She buried herself in study, not out of obligation, but out of defiance. The kind of defiance born when the world tells you no so many times that your only answer left is, "Watch me." Law became her calling, not just as a profession, but as a lifeline. While others treated justice as an abstract word, Crockett understood it as lived reality. She saw neighbors criminalized for poverty, families torn apart by systems designed to punish instead of protect, immigrants working themselves to the bone only to be dismissed as outsiders. These weren't headlines. They were human beings. She knew stories that lived in her own community, and she carried those stories with her like armor. When she entered public service, it wasn't with the polished ease of someone destined for politics. It was with the raw fire of someone who knew exactly why the fight mattered. She walked into rooms where she didn't belong, into institutions still heavy with the weight of exclusion, and made herself belong. Her very presence was resistance. Her very survival in those spaces was proof of possibility for others watching from the outside. And that is what made her powerful. Not privilege, not lineage, but resilience. Crockett's values weren't etched into policy platforms or rehearsed slogans. They were born in experience. She believed in dignity because she had lived without it. She believed in truth because she had been surrounded by lies. She believed in justice because she had seen injustice stretch its fingers into every corner of life. These weren't abstract ideals. They were her compass, pointing her forward when the path grew dark. For progressives, for immigrants, for young people who felt invisible, Crockett became a mirror. In her story, they saw their own. She was proof that the fight wasn't futile, that the struggle itself could shape a voice strong enough to shatter arrogance. When she spoke, it wasn't just for herself. It was for every student told they weren't smart enough, every worker dismissed as replaceable, every immigrant branded as unworthy. And yet Crockett never wore martyrdom. Her power lay in her calm. Unlike the antagonist, she didn't need to shout to prove herself. Her strength was quieter, but no less commanding, the steady flame that refuses to flicker, even when the winds howl. Where the antagonist's power came from belittling others, hers came from uplifting truths no one could deny. In the chamber that day, she carried all of it with her. The childhood slights, the courtroom battles, the voices of those who had been silenced. She knew the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that millions outside those walls were waiting for someone, anyone, to prove that dignity could still hold its own against arrogance. She knew that her words would not just be her own, they would be history speaking through her. And so, she sat calm against the storm while the antagonist mocked and dismissed. To the casual eye, it looked like restraint. But to those who knew, it was preparation. Crockett wasn't ignoring the attacks. She was absorbing them, letting the antagonist's arrogance overextend, letting them build the very case that she would dismantle with a single response. For her, this wasn't just a debate. This was destiny. Every moment of her journey had led here. The child underestimated, the student defiant, the lawyer relentless, the leader unshaken. This was not about winning points in a chamber. This was about showing the world that dignity could stand unbent. The irony, of course, was that the antagonist never saw it coming. They mistook silence for weakness, composure for hesitation. They thought they were breaking her down, when in reality, they were setting her up. They thought this was their performance, but Crockett knew it was her moment. And when her moment finally came, Crockett didn't just speak, she shook the chamber. The chamber air grew heavier with every passing minute, as though the oxygen itself was being squeezed out by the sheer force of ego. The antagonist, emboldened by the sound of their own voice, leaned forward on the desk with the swagger of someone who believed the floor belonged solely to them. Their words grew sharper, their interruptions more pointed, their tone dripping, with the smug confidence of a performer convinced the audience was already in the palm of their hand. Every time Crockett opened her mouth, they cut across her with a quip, a laugh, or a sarcastic aside. "Let me correct you," they sneered, wagging a finger in her direction as though scolding a child. When she pressed forward anyway, they sighed dramatically, rolling their eyes in exaggerated frustration for the cameras. The dismissiveness was calculated. It wasn't just about undermining her point. It was about undermining her very right to speak. The hostility rose like a tide. Whispers broke out among the gallery. Reporters leaned closer, scribbling down every jab. Social media, watching in real time, began to hum with anticipation. Clips were already being cut, ready to circulate within seconds. And through it all, Judge Allison Jones sat perched in silence, leaning just slightly forward, her hand pressed to her chin. She wasn't merely listening, she was studying. The antagonist, drunk on the sound of their own performance, grew bolder. Their gestures widened, their voice thundered louder, their words sharpened to the edge of insult. They thought they were winning. They thought they had cornered her. But Crockett never flinched. She held her ground with a composure that cut deeper than any insult. Her eyes stayed locked on the antagonist, unblinking, steady, a mirror reflecting arrogance back on itself. She didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, didn't let the bait pull her off balance. Instead, she waited, her silence louder than their mockery, her calmness, a contrast so sharp it made the antagonist's bluster look cartoonish. The difference was stark. On one side, a storm of noise, all heat and no light. On the other, a flame that refused to flicker, steady even as the winds howled. The longer Crockett held her silence, the more the room began to shift. Whispers grew into murmurs. Even those who had entered skeptical began to sense it, that something was building, something just beneath the surface. The antagonist didn't notice. They were too wrapped up in their performance, too enthralled with the echo of their own voice to see the subtle shift in the room. Every insult, every dismissive chuckle only made the silence more unbearable, the anticipation more electric. Crockett's hand rested on the desk, still and firm. Her breathing was even, her expression unshaken. She wasn't reacting. She was preparing. Each interruption, each jab was being stacked like kindling, and when the spark finally struck, it wouldn't just burn, it would ignite. By now, the chamber buzzed with restless energy. Lawmakers leaned toward one another, whispering predictions. Reporters' pens scratched faster. Judge Jones adjusted, her glasses, her gaze flicking between the antagonist and Crockett, as though she could feel the weight of what was coming. The tension had risen to the breaking point, stretched so tight it felt like one more word could snap it in half. And then, Crockett unleashed the words that no one saw coming. The silence was unbearable. It hung in the chamber like a held breath, thick and tense, waiting for release. The antagonist had just finished another mocking aside, convinced they'd backed Jasmine Crockett into a corner. They smirked, leaned, back in their chair, and folded their arms as if the performance was over. To them, the story was already written, but Crockett knew better. She lifted her chin slowly, eyes locked on her opponent, and let the pause stretch a second longer than anyone expected. That pause was not weakness, it was control. Every camera in the room shifted, every pen hovered above paper, every spectator leaned forward. Judge Allison Jones narrowed her gaze, sensing the shift before it even began. And then Crockett spoke. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried like a bell across marble. Calm, measured, unshaken. "You know," she began, "it's fascinating to me how loudly arrogance tends to speak when truth walks into the room." Gasps rippled from the back, rose. The antagonist's smirk faltered, just slightly, but it was enough. Crockett pressed on, her tone sharpened not by volume but by precision. "For years," she continued, "people like you have mistaken silence for weakness. You've mistaken patience for ignorance. You've mistaken dignity for submission. But let me assure you, what you call weakness is the very strength you'll never understand." The antagonist shifted in their chair, forcing a laugh, but the sound rang hollow. The chamber didn't laugh with them. Instead, murmurs spread, building like a low drum roll. Crockett leaned forward now, her hands steady on the desk. "You've built a career on dismissing people who look like me, who come from communities like mine. You've told yourself that privilege is proof of superiority, but privilege isn't proof. It's insulation, and insulation doesn't make you stronger. It makes you fragile." Judge Jones's lips parted in surprise, her pen frozen above her notepad. For the first time that day, the attention wasn't on the antagonist's theatrics. It was fixed, entirely on Crockett. She let that moment breathe. Another pause. The kind of pause that forces every listener to hang on the next word. And then she struck again. "You sit here mocking me, mocking this process, mocking the very people who sent us here to speak for them. But let me tell you something you don't seem to understand. Respect is not earned through insults. Power is not proven through volume, and history does not remember the loudest voice in the room. It remembers the one who tells the truth." My chamber erupted in murmurs, louder this time, the kind of sound that said the tide had turned. Even the reporters scribbling furiously seemed to know they were documenting a moment that would live beyond the hearing. The antagonist opened their mouth to interject, but Crockett cut through them with the sharpest weapon she had: composure. She didn't raise her volume, didn't rush. Instead, she slowed down, each word deliberate, each phrase like a hammer striking a nail. "You believe you can intimidate me. You believe you can silence me. But what you don't understand is that I don't speak for myself alone. I speak for every person who has been told to know their place. I speak for every immigrant who has been treated as invisible. I speak for every young woman who has been mocked for daring to stand in these spaces. And I will not be silenced. Not by you. Not by anyone." The antagonist's face flushed, their smirk gone, replaced by a tight jaw and restless shifting. They glanced toward their allies, as if seeking reassurance, but found none. The room's energy had turned. Crockett wasn't reacting to them anymore. They were reacting to her. Judge Jones leaned back now, her expression equal parts astonishment and admiration. She wasn't just hearing testimony, she was witnessing a dismantling. Crockett delivered, the final strokes with the calm precision of someone who knew the ending before anyone else did. "The irony, of course," she said, her voice steady, "is that while you've tried to paint me as unworthy, you've revealed the truth about yourself. That the only way you know how to stand tall is by trying to make others small. And that is not strength. That is weakness, masquerading as power." A hush fell. Even the whispers quieted. The antagonist's hand twitched nervously on the desk, their carefully constructed image of control crumbling under the weight of Crockett's words. And then came the mic drop. Crockett straightened her posture, looked directly into the cameras, and delivered the line that would echo across the nation. You can try to erase dignity with arrogance, but history will remember who stood on the side of truth. And today, it isn't you. The chamber fell silent. No retorts, no laughter, no interruptions. Just silence. The kind of silence that confirms victory, the kind that signals everyone knows the balance has shifted. Judge Jones exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving Crockett. The reporters exchanged glances, realizing they'd just witnessed the moment that would dominate headlines. Even the antagonist, so loud minutes earlier, sat frozen in their chair, stripped of the armor of arrogance. The silence stretched, powerful and undeniable. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She seized the narrative. But the real explosion wasn't inside the chamber. It was online. The chamber may have fallen into silence, but outside those walls, the noise was deafening. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's response was everywhere, spliced into 30-second videos, subtitled for TikTok, slowed down, and replayed in dramatic loops on Twitter. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Crockett clapped back. Dignity wins. Speechless. By the end of the night, all three were trending worldwide. On Instagram, the moment was turned into artwork. A freeze frame of Judge Allison Jones's stunned expression became a meme when dignity destroys arrogance. TikTok creators remixed Crockett's mic drop line over cinematic music, some pairing it with images of protests, others with footage of everyday Americans standing tall. One clip racked up 1 million views in under an hour, with captions screaming, "This is how you handle bullies." Twitter became the battleground of celebration. Influential voices weighed in almost instantly. "This is the leadership America deserves," one progressive senator tweeted. "Jasmine Crockett just schooled the entire establishment in under 3 minutes," wrote a viral activist account. Even celebrities who rarely dipped into politics joined the chorus. A Grammy-winning artist posted, "I felt that in my soul." Crockett didn't just speak, she spoke for all of us. Grassroots voices amplified the moment with just as much passion. A teacher in California tweeted, "Watch this with my students today. They said, 'She sounds like my mum.' That's the power of representation." A factory worker in Detroit posted a selfie with tears in his eyes. "Been waiting my whole life to hear someone speak truth like that." Meanwhile, the antagonist became the internet's favorite punchline. Clips of their smirk fading were slowed down and replayed endlessly with captions like, "Confidence.exe has stopped working, and arrogance meets reality." Memes flooded timelines, their exaggerated eye rolls juxtaposed with Crockett's calm stare, their mocking gestures edited next to collapsing towers of cards. Even late-night comedians jumped in within hours, mocking the antagonist's bluster as the political equivalent of tripping over your own shoelaces. Judge Allison Jones, too, found herself unexpectedly in the spotlight. Her composure during the exchange was lauded as a symbol of integrity. Editorials praised her restraint. How she allowed the drama to unfold without interference, giving space for truth to reveal itself. "Sometimes the best leadership," one columnist wrote, "is knowing when silence is more powerful than interruption." Clips of Jones's astonished reaction circulated widely, earning her the affectionate nickname, "The Witness," among online fans. As the hours passed, the ripple effect grew. News outlets replayed Crockett's words on loop, anchors calling it the moment that defined the hearing. Analysts dissected the exchange, noting the stark contrast between arrogance and dignity. commentators on both sides admitted, some grudgingly, that something extraordinary had happened, but the real power wasn't in the punditry, it was in the people. Marches and rallies that weekend played Crockett's speech over loudspeakers. Protest signs quoted her mic drop line in bold letters. History will remember who stood on the side of truth. For many, it wasn't just a viral clip, it was proof that someone inside the system could still speak with the clarity of those outside it. The antagonist, once so smug, now looked small. Their attempts at damage control fell flat, a half-hearted press statement claiming they had been taken out of context was met with derision online. The only thing taken out of context, one viral reply shot back, was your dignity. Their supporters tried to spin the moment as grandstanding, but even sympathetic outlets struggled to defend them. The visual of their silence, jaw tight, eyes darting, was too powerful to erase. Meanwhile, Crockett's star rose overnight. She was invited onto talk shows, her quotes printed on T-shirts, her name spoken in barbershops, college campuses, and dinner tables alike. For many who had long felt unseen, she became a symbol, not of perfection, but of defiance, resilience, and truth. And yet, beneath the laughter, beneath the celebration, something deeper stirred. Because Crockett's response wasn't just a viral moment, it was a moral turning point. In the quiet after the storm, when the memes had been shared and the headlines written, a deeper truth began to emerge. What Jasmine Crockett delivered that day was not just a rebuttal, it was a reminder that dignity, steady, patient, unshaken, will always outlast arrogance, no matter how loud, no matter how smug. For too long, politics has felt like a shouting match, where the biggest voice or the sharpest insult wins the moment. But Crockett's words rewrote that script. She showed that composure can cut deeper than cruelty, that clarity can ring louder than bluster. In a room designed to intimidate, she reminded the nation that respect is not given by titles or power. It is earned by truth. This was more than a clash of personalities. It was the embodiment of every struggle where identity is questioned, where immigrants are told they don't belong, where women of color are underestimated. Crockett's calm defiance became a mirror for millions who have endured the smirk of dismissal, the condescension of entitlement, the arrogance of those who believe their power is permanent. And in that mirror, people saw themselves not as victims, but as victors in waiting, because dignity, once spoken aloud, cannot be silenced. The narrator's voice swells. This wasn't just politics, it was history unfolding in real time. A chapter that told every student, every worker, every dreamer, you are not invisible, you are not voiceless, and when you speak your truth, the world must listen. Crockett reframed the entire confrontation as something larger than herself. She wasn't just defending her own integrity, she was lifting the principle that justice belongs to everyone, that respect is not a favor handed down from the powerful, but a birthright carried by the people. In that chamber, arrogance cracked, and through the crack, light poured in. Judge Jones's stunned silence symbolized more than shock. It symbolized recognition, that even within the cold machinery of hearings and procedures, humanity can break through, that even in halls built for the few, the voices of the many can rise. As news cycles moved on, the resonance lingered. Students in classrooms quoted Crockett's words in debates. Workers carried her line into union meetings. Families replayed the clip at dinner tables telling their children, "See, that's how you stand tall when someone tries to belittle you." Because what we witnessed wasn't just politics, It was the power of truth standing unshaken. And truth, when wrapped in dignity, does more than win arguments. It inspires movements. It gives people courage to speak when silence seems safer. It transforms a single voice into an echo that carries across generations. The lesson was clear. Arrogance may dominate a room for a moment, but dignity shapes history. Arrogance crumbles under its own weight, but dignity stands because it is grounded in justice, respect, and the unshakable belief that every person matters. And that is why this moment mattered. Not only because Jasmine Crockett won an exchange, but because she reminded the country of its better self. She reminded us that strength is not in cruelty, but in clarity, that respect is not begged for, but lived, that justice is not delayed, but demanded. The narrator lowers to a steady, deliberate tone. And if dignity can win here, imagine what we can achieve together. Judge Allison Jones sat in quiet awe, her expression captured in a freeze frame that would define the moment. Jasmine Crockett's words had not only pierced through the noise of arrogance, but had left millions across America utterly speechless. The title of this story wasn't just a headline. It was a truth felt in living rooms, classrooms, and hearts everywhere. What we saw was more than a fiery exchange. It was a lesson etched into history. Arrogance struts, but dignity stands. The antagonist in this story became a cautionary tale, proof that entitlement cannot withstand the steady gaze of truth. And Crockett, calm yet commanding, emerged as a symbol for everyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to stay quiet. This channel exists to tell those stories, to lift the voices that remind us of our power, our resilience, and our right to demand justice. And if you felt even a spark of inspiration watching this unfold, you're not alone. Millions did too. So here's the invitation. Join this community. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of a movement that believes in truth over arrogance, dignity over mockery, justice over noise. Because when you share, when you speak, when you stand, you become part of the very echo that arrogance fears most. And as the screen fades, remember this. Moments like these are not gifts from the powerful. They are victories carved by courage. Victories that remind us who we are and who we can be when we refuse to bow. Because justice is never handed down, it is spoken into existence.